This is Paul Schneiderman today on the 150th edition of the Sports Untold podcast, also on Rainier Avenue Radio based in Seattle. My special guest today is one of America's top political pundits and commentators, Chris Cillizza. Chris has also been working as a sports commentator for many years, so he's a perfect guest for Sports Untold. Chris is based in our nation's capital. And, I got to tell you something, Chris, here in Seattle, we like to call Washington, D.C., D.C., and we like to call it the other Washington. So
That's
that's
fine with me.
okay. So we usually
Yeah,
say DC based in Washington State.
totally accurate.
Okay, but my podcast is now on Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, Google, iTunes, Podbean. You can go to sportsuntold podcast.net. I encourage my listeners to click the like button on my show. My producer, Olivia Coyne, is here. Olivia's going to ask some questions to Chris today. Olivia's doing a great job. Recent University of Washington graduate. She's now applying to law school, doing some work in my law firm and helping my podcast. Well, Chris, let me get back to you. Many of you are familiar with Chris Cillizza. He was formerly at the Washington Post. He had a long career at CNN and MSNBC. He was a familiar TV presence in people's living rooms. Chris is now doing an excellent job on his own with his own YouTube channel, blog. And Chris, give a little infomercial for a minute. Tell us about your podcast and
Sure.
your blog. And I'm a subscriber to it. So throw out some.
Sure, absolutely. I started writing for Substack in February 2023 as sort of a lark, honestly, mostly to keep my days organized, because after CNN laid me off, I would drop the kids off at the bus at 7:45 in the morning. I'd get back to my house at 7:50 in the morning, and I'd look at my calendar, and the next thing on it was pick kids up at bus at 3:45 in the afternoon. So I was like, I got to do something with my day. So I kind of started it just because I like writing and thinking about politics. Oh, and I've always sort of done it. But it's grown. We just recently passed 20,000 subscribers, which is awesome. The YouTube channel I started around the same time because, again, I like talking about politics, and we are at 47,000 subscribers there. So right now, all of my content is free. So I always say it's worth exactly what you're paying for it. So go check it out. You got nothing to lose, literally. And I'm making a ton of it. So, I'm enjoying it. It's been fun. It's fun not to have a boss. It's a little scary. In that you never know exactly sort of how much you're going to make and when you're going to make it. You got to work. I've worked harder in the last 18 months than I worked certainly in the 18 months before that. But, it's been challenging and rewarding simultaneously. It's like parenting.
Well, Chris, you can also become a paid subscriber. I'm one of your paid subscribers. Tell people how they can become a paid subscriber.
Yes. So basically, from now until the election, I'm giving everything away for free. But after the election, obviously, I'm not. And I would say if you're a paid subscriber, I give you right now it's $5 a month, $50 for a year. Normally, it's $6 a month, $60 for the year. And I give you exclusive access to a bunch of stuff. You get all my content. You get an email every Sunday with kind of like the stuff I like the best from the internet. You get a Zoom call one-on-one with me if you want that. So, and again, I think the other thing you get is if you believe in independent and nonpartisan journalism, and I hope a bunch of people do, you get the warm feeling of knowing you're supporting someone who's trying to do just that.
Great. Love it. I wanted to get a little infomercial out for Cillizza.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris is also the host of Monumental Sports about politics and sports. Chris is the author of a couple books, including this great 2023 book that I read, Power Players, Sports Politics, American Presidency. Great book that we'll talk about. Well, Chris, we're similar guys. Sports, politics, entertainment, culture. Your host, Paul Schneiderman, and Chris Cillizza, we have similar interests. So we're going to have fun today. Thanks for coming on Sports Untold, Chris.
Happy to.
Great. Well, Chris, let me, you brought something up about leaving CNN, and tell me if you find this kind of relatable. You're kind of like an attorney who was at a firm and left the firm, and you're creating your own law firm now. Is that a good way? Is that a bad analogy?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a bad analogy at all. My mom always wanted me to go to law school, so I'm sure she would be happy with a comparison of me as a lawyer. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, I just think the mainstream media, it's not going to go away. I mean, these people, like CNN's not going away anytime soon. The New York Times is not going to disappear. The Washington Post's not going to stop publishing. But it's a terrible, for the most part, a terrible business environment for journalism. Local journalism has been totally devastated. National journalism has been devastated, not totally, but it's on its way. And I think that we are kind of moving into a world of independent creators. I saw something that I was struck by. The top 10 most listened to podcasts on Spotify, 9 of them are independent operators. One of them, The Daily, is affiliated with a mainstream news organization. I think we're going to keep going in that direction. You know, my kids who are 15 and 12, they're on YouTube all the time. You know, and so I think it's kind of, again, I didn't make this choice. I always say to people, I would have stayed at CNN through the end of my contract, but thrust into this, the thing I've learned really is that there really is an economic and business model for solo or small groups of content creators that I'm not sure exists for mainstream media going forward.
Well, Chris, although we're in different fields, I found some of your posts about leaving CNN relatable in different ways. I worked at a couple of law firms, completely different situation, but I think a lot of people find your transition relatable. I just want to share that.
Thank you. I mean, you know, one thing that I was amazed by, like, in a lot of ways, I didn't really have a choice, like, because I was and sort of am a public figure. You know, people wrote about me being laid off. It was like a thing. So people I didn't know would like come up to me and be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear it." So I had to talk about it. I couldn't just be like, well, I'm on to my next great opportunity. But one thing that I found out in doing that was there's this weird social stigma about being laid off. 40% of people will be laid off at some point in their career.
Wow.
The vast majority of those people, they didn't do anything wrong. You're just a line on a spreadsheet, right? I mean, you probably make too much money, if you're being honest, for a company that needs to cut costs. So I kind of thought to myself, you know what, like, I don't have a choice. Mine's out there. I can't sort of spin it as, you know, anything other than what it is. So rather than kind of play into that stigma, I was like, I'm just going to talk about it and write about it. Because you know what, like, parts of it sucked, you know, and that's okay. It's all right. Not everything is perfect. Your life doesn't move in one continuous upward swing. There are ups and downs, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that. And
no doubt.
I sort of wanted to use the opportunity, and to the extent the platform that I have, to make sure people do that.
Appreciate all your insights, Chris, and about dealing with a life transition. Chris, you work with a famous American columnist, political columnist, George Will, definitely known as a public intellectual. He's kind of an anti-Trump conservative now, I think. But George Will is also a huge baseball fan, and I have one of his books right here, Bunts, which I read.
Yes, I worked on that one. I think.
Yeah.
I think I'm in the acknowledgments, maybe.
Okay. I haven't looked at it in years, but I want you to share with us, what was it like working with George Will? And can you share a couple baseball insights or anecdotes you remember George Will sharing with you?
So, I worked for George Will from the time I was 19 to my senior year of college. I was not particularly political then. I didn't follow politics. I mean, I knew who he was, but I was mostly in it because at the time, if my memory serves me, this is 96 to 98. I think he paid $12.50 an hour, which was an absolute king's ransom when I was in college. And I went to Georgetown, and his office is, I don't know if it still is, but at the time was just kind of at the bottom of Georgetown, so I could walk there and it was easy. Most of my stories do not, he's very private and quiet. He always was. So it's not, I always say to people, if he walked by me on the street today, I would say there's an under 5% chance he would know who I was.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. He sort of kept to himself. I mean, I worked for him for 3 years, but, you know, it was 35 years ago. Most of my interactions with him, this is so funny. It's so humbling. It was like, this is so old, but think about the time, 96 to 98. He didn't even have Microsoft Windows on his computer. He still had WordPerfect. And so I didn't know this, but WordPerfect is a bunch of like keyboard commands. He'd always be like, my computer is broken. And I'd have to like go to his office on the second floor of a townhouse. Ours, the intern's office is on the third floor. I'd have to go down and like peck at various things to try to fix his My fondest memory of working for George Will as it relates to baseball, I did get to edit. I mean, edit. I looked over his columns. He had an editor, obviously. I was 19, 20, 21. But I did a bunch of research for it, which was awesome because I love baseball. And the best baseball-related story as it is George Will. So back then, Washington did not have a baseball team. There were no Nationals, Montreal. So the closest baseball team were the Orioles. And in Baltimore, which is, with no traffic, which there's never no traffic, but with no traffic, it's probably like a 50-minute drive. And George Will had season tickets to the Orioles. And they were right above the first baseline, home dugout, 3 rows up. And we would go and
we're kind of breaking up
just because, it's far and he had a bunch of other works in the publishing. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting near the Capitol. I'm sorry. I'm driving. I will be.
No, it's okay.
If you give me 3 minutes, I will. I promise the signal will be better. I'm just kind of weaving through Washington at the moment.
No problem.
We used to go to Orioles games all the time and sit in the 3rd row, which was amazing and spoils you for future baseball because you never have seats that good.
And did you have some fun baseball conversations with him at a couple of those Orioles games?
No, because he would never go with us. We would take his son. We would take his son John, who has Down syndrome, who I loved, wonderful guy. He was in his 20s probably at that point. His George Will's eldest son John, and he loved baseball, so we would always hang out with him. But no, George would never go with us.
Okay. Well, so not any your interactions with George Will were kind of limited, but I wanted to ask the question about any baseball insights you got from him. But he sounded like kind of a little bit of a distant guy in some ways. But Chris, I have 2 questions for you. I usually ask these questions later in the interview, but I'm going to get them out now. It's a couple of my favorite questions I've been asking guests for a few years now. And your answer can be a manager, an owner, a player, an executive. Who is a living sports figure you'd love to interview and spend time with? And who is a deceased sports figure in history you would have loved to have interviewed or spent time with?
Oh, my hero growing up, I grew up in Connecticut. My hero growing up was Don Mattingly. I loved Don Mattingly. The Yankees weren't all that good in the mid 80s, which is when I was sort of like right in my prime rooting interest, but I loved him. So I would love, and now he's gone on to be a manager, and I would love to interview Don Mattingly.
Right.
Can I do one more person? I would love to interview Sandy Koufax too.
Absolutely.
I think he's, for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously the baseball reasons. He's one of the best left-handed pitchers of all time, but also because he's just an interesting and smart and thoughtful guy. Having interviewed lots of politicians and lots of athletes, there are some smart, interesting ones. There are also some ones that are not terribly smart and not terribly interesting. But I think Sandy Koufax, I would love to interview him.
Me too.
The deceased, I know I'm doing all baseball, but I'm just going to stay with a theme. Deceased, sure. I'll tell you what. So I was July 21st of this year was the day Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race. It was a Sunday. I was at the Baseball Hall of Fame with my son. One of my younger son was playing in a baseball tournament up there, and his team, we went to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And right before Joe Biden dropped out, or somebody told me Joe Biden dropped out, I remember reading this thing about Ty Cobb. And my Ty Cobb take up until reading this was Ty Cobb is amazing, obviously amazing baseball player, but pretty bad racist, bad guy. Right. And this thing in the Hall of Fame was Ty Cobb was actually not racist. He actually got a really bad rap. So I don't know which is true, but I would love to interview Ty Cobb about that because I feel like my sense of Ty Cobb is entirely based on oh, bad guy, hated black people, and maybe he did, but I was just I had never had other information sort of given to me about him, so I think he's totally fascinating. One other, I grew up in Connecticut. My dad's team was the New York Yankees, and he loved Mickey Mantle, and Mantle is such a tragic figure in a lot of ways. Yeah, I mean, like so much ability, depending on who you talk to, kind of pissed it away. I mean, like the drinking and so like I'm drawn to very human people who have like flaws, people who are incredibly talented at something but struggle in other ways. And Mantle, I think, would be fascinating to talk to in that regard.
Great names: Cobb, Mantle, Mattingly, Koufax. Koufax may be about number one living sports figures I'd love to talk to. Great names. Real quickly, you're a political journalist, political pundit yourself. Who's a living political journalist or pundit? I know you know a lot of them. You love to get deep
Yep.
with, have a conversation with. Who's a deceased one in history who'd have loved to have spent some time with?
So it's funny. The person that, well, I'll give you two. And I actually got to spend time with both of them. Not a ton, but some. So when I started at the Washington Post, David Broder, legend, was there, still writing and working. And I got to hang out with him. I would have loved to hang out. He was in his at least 70s, might have been 80s by that time. I would have loved to hang out with like the 40-year-old David Broder. That would be cool. But I did get to spend time with David Broder, which is like so awesome to me. The other one that I got to spend a little bit of time with, it was like a gigantic. I still remember the day. So back in the day on MSNBC, obviously Tim Russert hosted Meet the Press, but on MSNBC he had a thing called the Tim Russert Show, where he would have like one or two guests on, talk about politics. Sometimes they talk about like a book. He'd have authors on. It was more of a general interest show, and I still remember the first time they asked me to be on that show. I was like, I have made it in life. And so I did get to spend a little bit of time with Tim, but not enough. I mean, I just think he's the thing I loved about him is he loved the game of politics. He embraced the game of politics. He understood how politics actually worked. And obviously gone way, way too soon. So the two of them, again, I did get to spend time with them, but I would love to spend more time with both of them.
Great names. And who's a living political pundit? I'm sure, like I said, you know a lot of them already, but who's someone you'd love to really get deep with in a conversation?
So yeah, I'll give you my favorite political journalist. And I know him, we're friendly, we're not like best friends, but I've known him for a long time. Peter Baker, who's at the New York Times. So when I started at the Washington Post, I was, let's see, that would have been 2006-ish. He was there. He had been the Richmond bureau chief. He's not old. He's like 5 years older than me, maybe. He'd been the Richmond bureau chief for the Post back when that meant something. And then had come to the national desk. And he and his wife, Susan Glasser, were there. And Susan eventually became the editor of the national section. And Peter wrote. And then then Susan and Peter both left. Peter went to the New York Times. Susan went to she eventually wound up at the New Yorker. She did a bunch of different things, but she writes for the New Yorker now. He is the best political journalist of kind of our time, in my opinion. He's not really in the breaking news game anymore. He's more in the thing that I put the most value on, which is like, we're all looking at the same stuff. Like we're all looking at the same things that politicians say and the data that we know about. Like we're all looking basically at the same things. And Peter has a unique ability to connect dots that were there. It's not like they weren't there. I could have seen them, but I don't. And I don't think anybody else sees them either. And so he's my favorite. I just think he's incredibly fair, thoughtful, smart. He's someone I just really admire as a political journalist, like doing it the right way at a place and in a time where it's really hard to do that.
I've seen Baker on Networks. Great name. Great name. Hey, Olivia's going to jump in here. She has two great questions for you.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, my first one is sort of staying on that sports page a little bit. Watching the World Series, I think it was game 4, when that New York fan grabbed Mookie's glove.
Yes.
I kind of want to know your thoughts on this and the fact that that fan is now being celebrated, and if that kind of is indicative of a culture change and
Yeah, totally.
on there.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I remember Jeffrey Mayer catching the Jeter home run in Yankee Stadium. It was clearly he reached over. They didn't call it fan interference. They called it a home run. I remember Bartman getting in the way, the Cubs, and him being vilified and being run out of Chicago. So, like, sometimes, some ways, it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. At the same time, like, it is amazing to me how willing we are societally to excuse or even celebrate bad behavior when it works in our favor. It's just
True.
it's just remarkable. Like we should, like, as a general rule, you should not celebrate a fan who's trying to wrench the ball out of Mookie Betts' glove, and by the way, who could hurt Mookie Betts, right? I mean, like, just as if that happened to a Yankee, like, let's say that Aaron Judge in center did that, and it would be a mess. The New York media would be insane, and the New York fans. So, like, what's depressing to me is so much of what you think about things is entirely dependent on who you support. It's like, if Donald Trump did the same thing that Joe Biden did, but you're a Democrat, it's terrible. But if Biden does it, it's fine. Or if Harris does it, it's fine. And vice versa, certainly with Republicans. And that's the thing that I struggle with. It's like we have a very fungible ethics in this country, depending on, it's fine if the people you like do it, it's bad if the people you don't like do it. And, like, that's not really a moral code.
Situational ethics. Yep.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for. It's
Yep.
just brutal.
Right. Olivia, you have another good question for Chris. I love your analysis of the Mookie Betts situation. I enjoyed Olivia's question. Fire off your other question for Chris, Olivia.
This one is more related to politics. I'm from where I'm sitting and from where most people are sitting. Politics in America have changed a lot in the last 8-ish years in particular. And I would assume that's greatly changed your job as well. What do you see your job looking like in the future, and how much do you think that will be affected by this election, the outcome of this election?
I guess I'm not, like, in the doom category as it relates to this election. I think the media is going to survive whether Donald Trump wins or loses. But I do think the media is in the midst of a massive change, spurred by technology in terms of the rise of the phone, spurred by social media in terms of how and why people consume content, spurred by YouTube, Instagram. I mean, I do think you will continue to see mainstream media outlets shrink. So shrink staff-wise, shrink what they can cover, shrink what they pay people. And I think you'll continue to see the rise of independent creators. That includes people who have media and journalism training and background, and people who don't. I'm not sure that's a all good or all bad thing. I think the idea of the mainstream media as gatekeepers is dead. As sort of like the people who can decide what the public sees in terms of information. That they may still be fighting that war, but it's already over. But the other problem is, and we've seen it during this election, is, it used to be that you had to talk to certain mainstream media outlets if you wanted to reach a certain number of people. Well, that's not true anymore, right? So whether you think the Call Her Daddy podcast or Rogan have, obviously they have big audiences, no debate. But do they adhere to the same kind of journalistic standards that we would say are good for capital J journalism? I don't think they have those same standards. So it's like, it allows these politicians to go to friendly sources where they're going to get easier questions, where they're not going to be pressed on stuff. And I think that's kind of bad for democracy. So it's tough, because I think the leveling overall of the media, it used to be, it was like the New York Times was way up here and the CNN and Washington Post. And, like, if you were some individual content creator, you were way, 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 way down, not even on the chart. And now it's much more level. I think people just go to who they like and who they're interested in. The problem is that also means they often don't ever seek out anything with which they disagree or even hear anything with which they disagree. And that leads to the siloing and being like, so many people say to me in these, they say, how could anyone vote for Donald Trump? I don't know anyone voting for Donald Trump, or I don't know anyone who votes for Kamala Harris. And I'm like, well, both of those people are going to get over 60 million votes. So there's lots of people voting for them. So it worries me a little bit that people will be siloed, but I don't know. It feels like that's already happening. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you fight that. It feels like we're already in that space.
Chris, real quickly, is it okay to go to 12:35 or so Pacific time? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I can go until, so I'm sitting outside of the class,
Okay.
but I need to walk in. I would say 3:40. I need to end just because I have to.
Great. Chris, real quick question. Favorite sports movie?
Gosh, I'm a sap, so The Natural or Field of Dreams. The Natural is a little bit slow, or Hoosiers. The Natural is a little bit slow, I think, but God, I love it. And then Field of Dreams, just because of the like, hey, Dad, you want to have a catch? I have two boys, and man, that one just gets at the heartstrings. Hoosiers, basketball was the sport I always played growing up, so I love Hoosiers. And Dennis Hopper and Hackman are both so good in that. I think it's one of those. Those are all kind of dramas. For a comedy major league, I love. And
I'm
still
gonna
quote
put you on the spot, Cillizza. Pick one.
Probably Field of Dreams, even though I know it's schmaltzy and overly sentimental.
Yeah,
I'm schmaltzy and overly sentimental. So
gotcha. That's a good one. I like The Natural a lot. Those are good picks. Chris, you follow American politics very closely. I'm going to give you a counter historical factual. Let's say that Harris was not the nominee this year. Let's say Biden was not the nominee. As we look at this fall 2024 era, who would have been the best Democratic nominee? Yep. Beshear, Shapiro, Booker, Whitmer, Newsom, Buttigieg, Michelangelo. Pick one. Or pick a national ticket that would be better than Kamala and Walz. Maybe Beshear, Booker, Whitmer, Shapiro. Anyhow, pick who you think would have been a better nominee for the Democrats if Kamala loses this time.
Whitmer. Governor, Midwestern, female, tough, has won in a Democratic-ish leaning state, but not a Democratic state. I think she would be fine with the Democratic base, which you need. I mean, that's the Beshear problem, right? Look, I think he's a very talented politician. The problem is the positions you have to take to get elected as a Democrat in Kentucky are way more conservative than the national party. So I think there would be some issues there with the base. So I think Whitmer, to me, in terms of political ability, geography, gender, contrast with Trump, I think all of those, I think she would probably be my number one pick. Number two, probably Shapiro, young, able, fiery, from the swingiest of the swing states that you need if you're going to win as a Democrat. You need Pennsylvania. I think those would be my one and two probably. And I would say if I had my pick, like if it wasn't Harris, I think Harris would be in the top five, but not in the top two.
Gotcha.
Like I would pick Whitmer, or if I was a Democrat just wanting to win, I would pick Whitmer or Shapiro before I would pick Harris.
Great analysis.
It's too easy. The whole like liberal from San Francisco, like it's just too easy to label her for people who don't know anything about her, who live in the Midwest. And I think it would be harder to label Shapiro or Whitmer.
I also think the other name I mentioned that people don't hear about nationally as much, who's always impressed me, is Michelangelo, the former New Orleans mayor.
Yep.
I think he would
did from a very political family.
Right.
Sister was a senator from Louisiana. Father was the mayor of New Orleans.
Right.
I always worry about those long-standing political families if there's some baggage there. Sure. Like you just never know, particularly in Louisiana. But who knows? Yes, I think he's an impressive guy.
Yeah, maybe as Veep one day, or in a different world, he could have been a good Veep on another ticket. Yeah. Speaking of Josh Shapiro, I'm going to ask you a Shapiro question. I've read your blogs. You feel strongly that that Harris should have picked Shapiro. You make a great case as to why she should have picked Shapiro. But I'm going to ask you a different kind of question about Josh Shapiro. So back in 2000, nearly quarter century ago, Al
Yep.
Gore ran with Joe Lieberman, the first
Yep.
Jewish national ticket, and Gore won the popular vote with Lieberman. And I always thought, Chris, that one of the stories about Lieberman being on the ticket, although it was a story and a breakthrough, ended up not being as big a deal as some thought it was going to be. But now we go almost 25 years later, and there was an issue that some people raised about Shapiro being Jewish and running for vice president this year. Do you think America has taken a step back with the idea of a Jewish American national ticket? And is this something for the Jewish community that could be a problem in the foreseeable future as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. To me, the Shapiro is Jewish and therefore he can't be the VP thing is like very overblown. I think there's a certain segment of people, particularly given the situation in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and Lebanon, and like it is on for a certain segment of people, it really, really matters. I'm not sure that Josh Shapiro as the VP would mean they either were or weren't voting for Kamala Harris. I know it's a thing that people push back against when you say Shapiro makes a ton of sense. They'd always say, well, he's Jewish and they already have this problem in Michigan with Arab Americans. Like, I'm not going to certainly dispute that he's Jewish. Obviously, that's true. I don't know if that would have changed things. My view is like, I don't know what Tim Walz gets you. I mean, I don't know that a VP gets you anything, honestly. But I guess I would have said, okay, if I'm Kamala Harris, I have to win Pennsylvania. Is there anyone out there who gives me even a 1% more likely chance to win Pennsylvania? I think Shapiro would, and therefore I would have picked him. Yes, every one of these people is human, which means they come with good and bad, right? Like there's no pick that's perfect. That's the nature of the beast. Like anyone you could come up with, I could make a counter argument on why they wouldn't be good. But to me, the Shapiro thing, I guess the risk people associated with putting a Jewish guy on the ticket, I thought that was a little bit overblown, candidly. Okay. We'll never know, right? Because we can't go back and run it that way. But yeah, I thought it was, you got to find something bad about everyone, and I guess that was the quote unquote bad thing politically for him. I'm skeptical for at least part of the reason that you just cited. I mean, Lieberman was an Orthodox Jew. I mean, he walked everywhere on Saturday like it was a giant part of his personality, and I don't think Al Gore lost the electoral college because Joe Lieberman was Jewish. Right.
So you don't think it's a long-term issue about having a Jew on a national ticket?
I know.
Okay.
I know. I mean, look, you never know for sure because it's so hard to get people to honestly respond to a question like that. Would someone's ethnicity, being Jewish or religion, make you less likely to vote for them? Even if it would, lots of people won't tell a pollster that. I mean, look, I remember in 2002. Yeah, 2001, 2002, a guy named Barack Obama came in. He was running against, I was working at the Cook Political Report at the Roll Call newspaper at the time, and we would meet political candidates as they came in. He was running against a guy named Bobby Rush, member of Congress from Chicago. And I remember walking out of that meeting and saying, like with Obama, and saying to a friend, a fellow reporter, man, no one named Barack Obama is getting elected to anything in this country. And 4 years later, he got elected to the Senate. And 2 years after that, now he lost the congressional race to Bobby Rush, but he won the Senate race 4 years later, and he got elected president 2 years later. Probably the most successful Democratic politician of our lifetime. So I always say you never know until you know. But I guess I don't see it as much. I guess I'm more skeptical that would be a major stumbling block.
Well, I think that's promising, your answer, that because of someone's ethnicity or religion, they wouldn't be precluded from being on a national ticket. Chris, I got about 5 minutes left. I want to talk about your book, Power Players, about the presidents in sports. And I remember years ago, the late Larry King said something I'll never forget. He said, President Nixon really knew the box scores. He was a huge baseball fan. President Reagan really didn't know sports that well. Do you agree with Larry's assessment?
100%. By the way, I remember being on Larry King Live when I was like 27. It was amazing. He had like the suspenders.
Right.
Yes, Larry is exactly right. Nixon was, by the way, both Nixon and Reagan were very indifferent athletes. Reagan was probably a marginally better athlete than Nixon, but neither of them were particularly good athletes,
Right.
even among the presidents. Nixon was a fanatic fan. He really was. He loved and he loved baseball more than any other sport. One of my favorite things, it's in the book, but one of my favorite stories is like at the end of a press conference, this is like in the early 70s, at the end of a press conference, this reporter from UPI, United Press International, which is a wire service that doesn't even really exist anymore, throws out like, "Hey, Mr. President, like who are your 5 favorite baseball players ever," or whatever. And Nixon says something, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, "Let me get back to you," which you assume, like as a reporter, when a politician says, "Let me get back to you," that basically means I'm never going to think about this for 1 second.
Right.
Nixon goes to Camp David with David Eisenhower, who's married to Julie Nixon, so it's his son-in-law. And he spends an entire weekend developing like detailed lists of teams. So he comes up with 4 teams. He basically comes up with a team from his youth and then a team from sort of modern day, so early 70s for American and National League. And these teams are like detailed. Like he's got like a lefty relief pitcher in there. Like he does a whole bullpen. He's just he's a numbers guy. He's kind of a nerd. He was socially awkward. He just wasn't good at talking to people, and sports was the way he did it. Reagan is like the exact opposite as a personality, right? Really gifted talker, very social, good empath, like good reader of people in a way Nixon is not. And what Reagan realizes when he's president is he's like, first of all, Reagan liked being around athletes. He thought it was cool. He always was like amazed at how tall Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was, like because Kareem would come to the White House because the Lakers would win a lot in the 80s, and Reagan was always amazed at how tall he was. Anyway, what Reagan realized was, if I'm around winners, people who've just won things, people who are admired, that's good for me politically. Like, that's like, it's good to be around success. So Reagan is the guy who formalizes what we now just sort of take as custom. He formalizes championship teams coming to the White House. They hand the jersey with your number on the back.
Right.
That was Reagan, which is totally fascinating to me because Reagan, to Larry King's point, Reagan didn't care about sports, really. He had gotten his start in kind of the broadcasting industry as a Cubs announcer in spring training in Arizona, but he was a very indifferent sports fan. The only sporting event that he would regularly tune into, fascinating, Notre Dame football, because he had played George Gipp in the Newt Rockne story.
That's right.
And he associated with Notre Dame football. But beyond that, he didn't really care. But he was smart at understanding how politics speaks to sports and sports speaks to politics.
Great point. Can I get 2 more questions in?
Yes, quickly though.
Quickly.
My students are waiting.
Jeff Pearlman's been on my show. He wrote that book.
Okay.
And in your book, you talk about Trump being a very lousy owner of a professional sports franchise, New Jersey Generals. Why is that not getting out more, that Trump was a terrible sports owner?
If you need to understand everything that Donald Trump has done in political life, you need to read Jeff Pearlman's book about exactly what Donald Trump did as the owner of the New York, New Jersey Generals, from the signing of Herschel Walker to the as insisting that it be played in the fall to compete with the NFL, to saying he would never try to leave for the NFL and leaving. I don't know. I think it's because it's ancient history to a lot of people. It was the 80s and people don't care anymore. But it's the 2 things that are the most instructive about who Donald Trump is and how he operates are Jeff's book and a book about Vince McMahon called Showman. Vince McMahon, the head of professional wrestling, which Donald Trump was very much involved in. Those 2 books, the Jeff's book came out a while ago. The Showman book recently came out. They're so insightful about Trump. I recommend them to everyone.
No doubt. You hit on Trump as a USFL owner as well. He was just a horrible owner. One more question. Would you ever, your book covers the presidents from Eisenhower through Biden. Would you ever write a book about some of the earlier presidents in sports? That's my first question. And as part of that question, Would George Washington been more of a basketball fan? Would Jefferson been more of a baseball fan? Would Adams been more of a hoops fan? I'm going to finish with those hypotheticals.
So, yes, I absolutely would. I actually thought about including a chapter. I did a bunch of research on the presidents before Eisenhower. It just got to be too long. It was just too much. I didn't want the book to be 800 pages long. My favorite, so Washington is the one I will latch on to, because Washington was like 6'2", which at the time was like being like 6'10". I mean, everyone was like John Adams. John Adams, like James Madison's like 5'4", shortest president ever. John Adams was slightly taller, but he was 5'6" Washington is like this massive guy. And one of the really interesting, and I think it's apocryphal, but one of the stories that come out all the time about Washington as I was doing my research is there's this story that he picked up like a ball. I don't know if it was a baseball or something, but that he picked up a ball and he threw it across the Potomac. Now, there's no way in hell you could throw a ball across the Potomac, but it speaks to the kind of mythic character of Washington.
Love it.
So there's a lot there. There's a lot there. Woodrow Wilson was a manager of the Princeton baseball team. I mean, there's a ton there. There's a ton of interesting stuff. FDR gathered the heads of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, who were the football titans at the time, to convince them that they needed to wear helmets when they played football because people were dying. I mean, there's a lot there. So I never rule out writing another book, but not currently. I had too many other things going on.
Chris, absolutely loved it. Let's stay in touch. Thanks for coming on the Sports Untold podcast, and I'll keep reading all your blogs and everything.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for tolerating me driving while talking.
No, it was great. I had a lot of fun.
Right,
Thanks.
well, I got to run. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.